The sun was shining bright on what should have been the most important day of the year for Midwest Manufacturing Corporation. Richard Wellington, the company's CEO, straightened his expensive tie one more time as he looked out of his office window at the parking lot below. Dozens of luxury cars were pulling up, each one carrying investors who had traveled from across the country to attend the annual shareholder meeting. Richard had been planning this day for months. The company's profits were up, their new contracts were promising, and everything seemed perfect. He had even decided to give the investors a special tour of their main production facility after the meeting. It would be the perfect way to show off their state-of-the-art machinery and impress everyone with how modern and efficient their operation was. The meeting went exactly as planned. Investors nodded approvingly as Richard presented the quarterly reports. The numbers looked great on paper, and everyone seemed satisfied with the company's progress. When he announced the factory tour, several investors perked up with interest. They had heard about the company's advanced equipment but had never seen it in action. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced with confidence, "you're about to see the heart of our operation. Our production facility houses some of the most advanced machinery in the entire industry." The group of about 20 investors followed Richard through the corridors that led to the factory floor. The sound of machines humming and workers moving about filled the air. Richard felt proud as he walked ahead of the group, pointing out different sections of the facility and explaining how each part contributed to their success. The factory floor was impressive by any standard. Huge machines lined the walls, each one performing a specific task in the manufacturing process. Workers in safety gear moved efficiently between stations, monitoring gauges and making adjustments as needed. The whole operation ran like a well-oiled machine, which was exactly what Richard wanted his investors to see. "And here," Richard said, stopping in front of a massive piece of equipment, "is our crown jewel. This German-engineered assembly unit cost us over $2 million, but it's worth every penny. This single machine can produce more in 1 hour than our old equipment could manage in an entire day." The investors gathered around the impressive machine, taking photos and asking technical questions. Richard beamed with pride as he explained the various features and capabilities. The machine was enormous, with multiple arms, conveyor belts, and computer screens showing real-time data about production rates and quality control. Everything was going perfectly until it wasn't. Without any warning, the machine let out a horrible, grinding sound that echoed throughout the entire factory. The rhythmic humming that had been the soundtrack to their tour suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Warning lights began flashing red, and alarms started beeping from different parts of the machine. Richard's smile vanished instantly. His face went from confident to confused to panicked in a matter of seconds. The investors looked around nervously, unsure of what was happening. Some of them stepped back from the machine, while others pulled out their phones to record what was unfolding. "What's going on?" one of the investors asked, his voice showing concern. "I'm sure it's nothing serious," Richard replied, but his voice lacked conviction. He had never seen this particular machine break down before, and certainly not in such a dramatic way. Workers from all over the factory floor began gathering around the silent machine. Their faces showed a mixture of confusion and worry. This wasn't just any piece of equipment that had failed. This was the centerpiece of their entire operation. When this machine stopped working, it meant the entire production line came to a halt. The head technician, a man named Pete who had been working at the factory for over 15 years, came running over with his toolbox. Sweat was already forming on his forehead, and Richard could see the panic in his eyes. Pete had been responsible for maintaining this machine since the day it was installed, and he knew better than anyone how serious this situation was. "What happened, Pete?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice calm even though he was feeling anything but calm inside. Pete was already opening panels on the machine and looking at various components. "I'm not sure yet, Mr. Wellington. It just stopped all of a sudden. Let me check the diagnostics." The next few minutes felt like hours. Pete moved around the machine, checking connections, looking at computer screens, and testing different systems. The investors stood in an awkward circle, whispering among themselves and occasionally glancing at Richard, who was trying his best to look like he had everything under control. "Well?" Richard finally asked when he couldn't stand the suspense any longer. Pete's face told the story before his words did. "We've got a problem, sir. This isn't something I can fix quickly. The machine has been having some intermittent issues for the past few weeks, but nothing like this. Our usual repair specialist, the guy who really knows these German systems, inside and out, is out of town dealing with a family emergency. He won't be back for at least a week." Richard felt his heart sink. A week? He couldn't have his main production line down for a week, especially not with investors watching. The financial implications would be enormous, not to mention the embarrassment of having this breakdown happen during the most important tour of the year. "Isn't there someone else who can fix it?" Richard asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Pete shook his head. "These German machines are incredibly complex. They require specialized knowledge and training. The few people who really understand them are either unavailable or work for companies that we compete with. They're not going to send their experts to help us." The investors were no longer trying to hide their conversations. Richard could hear fragments of their discussions, and none of it sounded good. Words like reliability issues and operational risks were being thrown around. This was turning into a disaster. Richard looked around the factory floor, hoping to see some miracle solution. His eyes moved from worker to worker, but most of them were just standing around looking as helpless as he felt. The pride he had felt just minutes earlier was completely gone, replaced by embarrassment and frustration. The machine that had been the star of his presentation was now a $2 million piece of junk sitting silent in the middle of his factory floor. The investors who had been impressed by his operation were now questioning whether they had made the right choice in trusting their money with his company. As Richard stood there, watching his perfect day fall apart, he had no idea that the solution to his problem was standing quietly in the corner of the factory floor. A young man in work boots and a faded shirt had been watching the entire scene unfold, and he was about to change everything. The silence on the factory floor was deafening. Richard Wellington stood there watching his career possibly crumble before his eyes. The investors were getting restless, some of them checking their watches, and others whispering among themselves. He could only imagine what they were thinking about his company's reliability and management. Pete, the head technician, was still frantically trying different approaches to get the machine working again. He had opened every panel he could find and was staring at diagnostic screens that showed error codes he had never seen before. The sweat on his forehead was getting worse, and his hands were starting to shake slightly from the pressure. "Any luck?" Richard asked for what felt like the 100th time. Pete looked up from the machine with defeat written all over his face. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wellington, I've tried everything I know. This is beyond my expertise. We really need that German specialist, but like I said, he won't be available for days." One of the investors, an older gentleman in an expensive suit, stepped forward. "Mr. Wellington, perhaps we should reschedule this tour for another time, when your equipment is actually functioning properly." The comment stung, but Richard couldn't argue with it. He was about to agree and try to salvage what was left of his reputation when something caught his eye. In the corner of the factory floor, near a supply closet, stood a young man who couldn't have been more than 17 or 18 years old. The boy was tall but lanky, wearing work boots that had seen better days and a flannel shirt that was faded from too many washes. He had been quietly sweeping the floor when the machine broke down, but now he was standing still, watching everything unfold with an expression that seemed different from the other workers. While everyone else looked confused or worried, this young man seemed curious. He was studying the machine from a distance, his head tilted slightly as if he was listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. There was something about his demeanor that caught Richard's attention, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The boy noticed Richard looking at him and quickly went back to his sweeping, as if he didn't want to draw attention to himself. But Richard had already seen that look of concentration on his face, and it made him wonder what the young man was thinking. "Who's that kid over there?" Richard asked Pete quietly. Pete glanced over at the boy. "Oh, that's Tommy. He's just a summer worker. Does cleaning mostly, some basic maintenance tasks. His family runs a farm outside of town. Good kid. Works hard, doesn't cause any trouble." Richard nodded, but kept watching the young man. There was something about the way Tommy had been, observing the machine that seemed different from how everyone else was looking at it. While the technicians were focused on the technical displays and error messages, Tommy seemed to be paying attention to the machine itself, its sounds, its vibrations, its physical condition. As the minutes ticked by and Pete continued to struggle with the repairs, Richard noticed that Tommy kept glancing over at the broken machine. The boy would sweep for a few seconds, then look over again, as if he was drawn to the problem but trying not to interfere. Finally, Tommy set down his broom and took a few steps closer to the group gathered around the machine. He stood at the edge of the crowd, clearly wanting to say something but hesitating because of his position as just a cleaning worker. Richard was watching this whole interaction when Tommy finally cleared his throat softly. "Excuse me," he said, in a voice that was quiet but clear. Pete looked up from the machine, clearly frustrated and not in the mood for interruptions. "Tommy, not now, we've got a serious problem here." But Tommy didn't back away. Instead, he took another small step forward. "I know, sir. I was just wondering. Maybe I could take a look at it." The suggestion was so unexpected that for a moment, nobody said anything. Pete stared at the teenager as if he had just suggested he could fly to the moon. Some of the other workers exchanged glances that clearly said they thought the kid had lost his mind. "You want to look at it?" Pete repeated, as if he hadn't heard correctly. Tommy nodded, his cheeks turning slightly red, but his voice remaining steady. "Yes, sir. I mean, I know I'm just supposed to clean and stuff, but I've worked on machinery before. Different kinds, but still, maybe I could help." Richard's assistant, a well-dressed woman who had been standing nearby taking notes, immediately stepped forward. "That's completely inappropriate," she said firmly. "This is a $2 million piece of equipment, not some farm tractor. We can't have untrained personnel." "Wait," Richard interrupted, holding up his hand. Something about the situation was bothering him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this young man than met the eye. The investors were starting to murmur among themselves again, and Richard could sense their patience wearing thin. He was running out of options, and the longer this went on, the worse it was going to look for his company. He looked at Tommy again, really studying the boy's face this time. There was something there, a confidence that seemed out of place for someone who was supposedly just a cleaning worker. It wasn't arrogance or cockiness, but rather a quiet assurance that suggested he might actually know what he was talking about. "You've worked on machinery before?" Richard asked. "Yes, sir," Tommy replied. "All kinds of equipment on our farm. Tractors, combines, irrigation systems. Some of it's pretty complex. My dad always says that machines are machines, and if you understand the principles, you can figure out most problems." Pete was shaking his head. "Mr. Wellington, with all due respect, farm equipment is completely different from precision manufacturing machinery. This is German engineering we're talking about. It requires specialized training and certification." Richard looked around at the crowd of people waiting for him to make a decision. The investors were checking their phones and looking impatient. The workers were standing around feeling helpless. Pete was clearly at the end of his rope with no solutions left to try. Then Richard looked back at Tommy, who was still standing there patiently, not pushing or demanding anything, just offering to help. There was something about the boy's calm confidence that made Richard think maybe, just maybe, he might be onto something. "What's the worst that could happen?" Richard said, more to himself than to anyone else. Then louder, he addressed Tommy, directly. "Fine, farm boy. Give it your best shot." The words came out with more sarcasm than Richard intended, and he immediately regretted his tone. But he was under enormous pressure, and frankly, he was desperate. If this teenager could somehow fix what the trained technicians couldn't, it would be a miracle. If he couldn't, well, they weren't any worse off than they already were. Some of the investors chuckled nervously at Richard's comment, clearly thinking this was either a joke or a sign that the CEO had completely lost his mind. The factory workers exchanged doubtful looks, wondering what this young man who spent his days pushing a broom could possibly know about their sophisticated equipment. Tommy didn't seem bothered by the skeptical reactions or Richard's sarcastic tone. He simply nodded respectfully and walked toward the silent machine, rolling up the sleeves of his faded flannel shirt as he approached. As he got closer to the massive piece of equipment, Tommy's whole demeanor seemed to change. The nervous teenager, who had been hesitant to speak up, was gone, replaced by someone who moved with purpose and confidence. He walked around the machine slowly, not touching anything yet, but observing it from every angle. Everyone watched in silence as this unlikely problem solver prepared to either save the day or embarrass himself in front of some very important people. Tommy stood in front of the massive machine, and for a moment the entire factory floor held its breath. The investors were watching with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Pete, the head technician, was standing nearby with his arms crossed, clearly thinking this was going to be a waste of everyone's time. Richard Wellington was feeling a knot in his stomach, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his career by letting a teenager mess with his most expensive piece of equipment. But Tommy seemed completely unbothered by all the attention. He walked slowly around the machine, taking his time to observe every detail. He wasn't rushing or trying to impress anyone. Instead, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that patience was the first step to solving any mechanical problem. "What's he doing?" one of the investors whispered to another. "Looks like he's just staring at it," came the reply. But Tommy wasn't just staring, he was listening. While everyone else had been focused on the flashing warning lights and error messages, on the computer screens Tommy was paying attention to something completely different. He put his ear close to different parts of the machine, moving from section to section as if he was having a conversation with the equipment itself. After a few minutes of this careful examination, Tommy stepped back and looked at the machine as a whole. He had a thoughtful expression on his face, like someone who was putting together pieces of a puzzle in his mind. "Can you hear something?" Pete asked, his skepticism starting to mix with genuine curiosity. "Yeah," Tommy replied simply. "It's not running right now, but I can still hear what's wrong with it." This comment drew confused looks from several people in the crowd. How could someone hear what was wrong with a machine that wasn't even running? But Tommy didn't seem to notice the confused stares. He was already moving to the next phase of his investigation. He began running his hands along different parts of the machine's exterior, pressing gently on various panels and components. His touch was light but purposeful, like a doctor examining a patient. He spent extra time on certain sections, pressing a little harder or tapping softly with his knuckles. "The hydraulics don't feel right," Tommy said, more to himself than to anyone else. Pete's eyebrows shot up. "The hydraulics? How can you tell that just by touching the outside?" Tommy looked up at the older technician with a slight smile. "Same way you can tell if a cow is sick just by looking at her. Everything's connected. When one part isn't working right, it affects everything else." The comparison between a sophisticated German manufacturing machine and farm animals drew a few chuckles from the crowd. But Tommy was completely serious. He continued his examination, now focusing on a specific section of the machine that housed the hydraulic systems. "I need to see inside this panel," Tommy said, pointing to a section that Pete had already opened and closed multiple times during his own troubleshooting attempts. "I already checked that area thoroughly," Pete said. The connections look fine, and the computer diagnostics don't show any problems with the hydraulic pressure." Tommy nodded respectfully. "I'm sure you did a great job checking it, sir, but sometimes computers don't catch everything. Would it be okay if I took a look anyway?" Pete hesitated for a moment, then shrugged and opened the panel again. "Go ahead, but I'm telling you, everything in there checks out fine." Tommy peered into the panel, but instead of looking at the same connections Pete had been examining, he focused on different components. He traced several hydraulic lines with his finger, following their paths even when they disappeared behind other parts of the machine. "There," he said suddenly, pointing to a section deep inside the panel. "That pressure valve is set wrong." Pete looked where Tommy was pointing and frowned. "That valve is set according to the manufacturer's specifications. I checked it against the manual just last week." "The manual might be right for normal conditions," Tommy said, "but this machine has been working extra hard lately, hasn't it? The pressure needs are different when you're running at higher capacity." This observation caught Richard's attention. It was true that they had been pushing the machine harder than usual to meet increased demand from their new contracts. But how could this young man know that just from looking at the equipment? Tommy didn't wait for an answer. He had already identified what he believed to be the problem, and now he was ready to fix it. "Do you have a hydraulic pressure gauge I could borrow?" he asked Pete. Pete was beginning to look genuinely interested now. He handed Tommy the requested tool along with a few other instruments that might be needed for hydraulic system work. What happened next amazed everyone watching. Tommy worked with a confidence and precision that seemed to come from years of experience, not from someone who was supposedly just a part-time cleaning worker. His movements were efficient and purposeful. He knew exactly which tools to use and how to use them. He started by carefully adjusting the pressure valve that he had identified as the problem. But he didn't just randomly turn it and hope for the best. Instead, he used the pressure gauge to monitor the changes he was making tiny adjustments and checking the results each time. The secondary drive system was getting inconsistent. "Pressure," Tommy explained as he worked. "When that happens, the whole timing sequence gets thrown off and eventually the machine shuts itself down to prevent damage." Pete was watching intently now, his earlier skepticism completely gone. "How did you know to check that specific valve?" "The diagnostics showed normal pressure throughout the system." Tommy paused in his work to answer. "The diagnostics probably checked the main pressure lines, right? But this valve controls pressure to a smaller system that feeds into the main one. If it's not calibrated right, the main system compensates for a while, but eventually it can't keep up." This explanation made perfect sense to Pete, who was beginning to realize that this teenager understood hydraulic systems better than he had given him credit for. But Tommy wasn't finished yet. After adjusting the pressure valve, he moved to another section of the machine. "There's also a sensor that's not positioned quite right," he said. "It's probably been giving slightly wrong readings, which threw off the computer's calculations." He located the sensor he was talking about and examined it carefully. It looked fine to everyone else, but Tommy could see that it had somehow shifted, just a tiny bit from its optimal position. "This probably happened gradually over time," Tommy said as he made delicate adjustments to the sensor's position. "Vibration from the machine running can sometimes cause things to move just a little bit, not enough to cause obvious problems right away, but enough to create issues over time." The investors were no longer whispering among themselves or checking their phones. They were all watching Tommy work, fascinated by his methodical approach and clear explanations of what he was doing. Finally, Tommy stepped back from the machine and wiped his hands on a shop rag. "I think that should do it," he said. "The pressure should be consistent now and the sensor should be giving accurate readings." Pete looked at the adjustments Tommy had made, then at the diagnostic screens. "Well, the error codes are gone," he said with surprise in his voice. "But let's see if it actually runs." Everyone gathered around as Pete initiated the startup sequence for the machine. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the machine began to hum back to life. The sound was different from before, smoother and more consistent. The machine reached full operation. The entire production line resumed its normal rhythm. The conveyor belts started moving again, robotic arms began their precise movements, and the various subsystems all fell into perfect synchronization. The factory floor, which had been silent except for worried conversations, was once again filled with the productive sounds of manufacturing. But now there was something else in the air too, a sense of amazement at what everyone had just witnessed. Tommy had not only fixed the machine, but he had done it faster and more effectively than anyone thought possible. The problem that had stumped the head technician and threatened to shut down production for days had been solved by a 17-year-old farm boy in less than 30 minutes. The sound of the machine running smoothly filled the factory floor, but Richard Wellington couldn't stop staring at Tommy. What he had just witnessed didn't make sense. This wasn't just a lucky guess or beginner's luck. The young man had diagnosed and fixed a complex problem that had completely stumped his most experienced technician. The investors were clearly impressed. Richard could see them nodding to each other and taking notes. What had started as a disaster was somehow turning into one of the most memorable demonstrations they had ever seen. But Richard's mind was racing with questions that had nothing to do with impressing investors. "Tommy," Richard said, stepping closer to the young man who was now putting the borrowed tools back where they belonged. "That was incredible work. Where did you learn to do that?" Tommy looked up from organizing the tools, his cheeks still slightly red from all the attention. "Thank you, sir. I just tried to listen to what the machine was telling me." "But how did you know about hydraulic pressure systems? And that sensor calibration technique you used? That's not something you pick up casually." The question seemed to make Tommy a bit uncomfortable, and he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Well, my dad taught me a lot about how machines work. We've got all kinds of equipment on the farm that needs fixing from time to time." Pete, who had been quiet since watching Tommy successfully repair what he couldn't, finally spoke up. "Son, I've been working on machinery for over 20 years, and I've never seen anyone diagnose a problem that quickly. Farm equipment is one thing, but this is precision German engineering. The principles might be similar, but the complexity is on a whole different level." Richard nodded in agreement. "Pete's right. What you just did requires a deep understanding of mechanical systems that goes way beyond general farm maintenance. I'm curious about your background. Tell me more about your family." Tommy seemed to realize that he wasn't going to be able to brush off their questions with simple answers. He glanced around at all the faces staring at him expectantly. The CEO, the investors, the factory workers who had watched him accomplish what none of them could do. "My family runs a farm about 20 miles outside of town," Tommy began slowly. "We grow corn and soybeans mostly, but we also raise some cattle. It's not a huge operation, but it keeps us busy." "And your father taught you about machinery?" Richard pressed gently. "Yes, sir. Dad always said that if you're going to be a farmer, you need to understand how everything works. We can't afford to call a repair service every time something breaks down, so we learn to fix things ourselves." This explanation made sense to a point, but Richard could tell there was more to the story. The level of expertise Tommy had just demonstrated went far beyond what most farmers would need to know, even those who did their own repairs. "What kind of equipment do you have on the farm?" one of the investors asked, genuinely curious now. Tommy seemed more comfortable talking. "About familiar territory. We've got 2 tractors, a combine harvester, several pieces of irrigation equipment, and a bunch of smaller machines for different tasks. Some of it's pretty old, but Dad keeps it all running." "That's impressive," Richard said. "But I have to ask, does your father have any formal training in mechanical engineering? Because what you just did suggests you've learned from someone with very advanced knowledge." The question hung in the air for a moment. Tommy looked down at his hands, then back up at Richard. There was something in his expression that suggested he was debating how much to reveal. "My dad knows a lot about machines," Tommy said carefully. "He's always been good with mechanical things." Richard sensed that Tommy was being evasive, but he didn't want to push too hard and make the young man uncomfortable. Instead, he tried a different approach. "Tommy, what's your father's name? Maybe I know him. The farming community around here isn't that large." For the first time since this whole conversation started, Tommy looked genuinely nervous. He glanced around as if checking to see who was listening, then looked back at Richard. "His name is Robert Thompson," Tommy said quietly. The name hit Richard like a physical blow. His face went completely white, and he had to grab onto a nearby workbench to steady himself. Several of the investors noticed his reaction and moved closer, wondering what had caused such a dramatic response. "Robert Thompson," Richard repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Tommy nodded, clearly puzzled by Richard's reaction. "Yes, sir. Do you know him?" Richard couldn't speak for a moment. His mind was racing back 15 years to when this very machine was first installed. He remembered the brilliant engineer who had worked with the German manufacturers to customize the equipment for their specific needs. The man who had spent months fine-tuning every system, calibrating every sensor, and training the original technicians on proper maintenance procedures. Dr. Robert Thompson had been a legend in the industry. He held multiple engineering degrees from prestigious universities, had several patents to his name, and was considered one of the foremost experts in precision manufacturing systems. Every major corporation had tried to recruit him at some point, and then suddenly he had disappeared from the corporate world. Richard remembered hearing rumors about Dr. Thompson leaving his high-paying job to pursue a simpler life, but no one knew exactly what had happened to him. The engineering community had been shocked by his departure. "Mr. Wellington," Tommy said, concerned by the CEO's strange reaction. "Are you okay?" Richard looked at Tommy with completely new eyes. Suddenly, everything made perfect sense. The deep understanding of mechanical principles, the intuitive grasp of complex systems, the confidence in approaching problems that would intimidate most technicians, it all came from having one of the most brilliant engineers in the country as a teacher. "Tommy," Richard said slowly, "does your father have a doctorate in mechanical engineering from MIT?" Tommy's eyes widened in surprise. "You do know him." "Know him?" Richard said, his voice getting stronger as the shock began to wear off. "Tommy, your father designed this machine. Well, not exactly this machine, but the original prototype that this one is based on. He worked with our company 15 years ago to develop the specifications for our entire production line." The factory floor went completely silent. Even the sound of the running machinery seemed to fade into the background as everyone processed what Richard had just revealed. Tommy stood there looking stunned, as if he had never considered that his father's past work might be connected to the place where he had gotten a summer job. "Dr. Robert Thompson is your father?" Pete asked in amazement. "The Dr. Thompson who wrote the maintenance manual for this equipment?" Tommy nodded slowly, still looking overwhelmed by all the attention and revelations. Richard shook his head in disbelief. "No wonder you were able to fix this machine so easily. You've probably been learning about these systems your entire life, haven't you?" "I guess so," Tommy admitted. "Dad never really talked about his work before farming, but he's always been teaching me about engineering principles. He says understanding how things work is important no matter what you do in life." One of the investors stepped forward. "Young man, do you realize what this means? Your father is considered one of the most brilliant engineers of his generation. He solved problems that other people said were impossible to solve." Tommy looked uncomfortable with all the praise. "He's just my dad. I mean, I know he's smart, but to me, he's just the guy who taught me how to fix the tractor and milk the cows." Richard was beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. Dr. Robert Thompson, one of the most respected engineers in the industry, had been quietly living on a farm for the past 15 years, passing his incredible knowledge on to his son through hands-on teaching and practical application. The young man who had just saved Richard's company from a potentially disastrous situation wasn't just a farm boy who had gotten lucky. He was the son of the very engineer who had helped create the systems he had just repaired. He had been trained by a master, even if that training had taken place in a barn instead of a classroom. "Tommy," Richard said, his voice filled with a mixture of respect and amazement, "I think we need to have a much longer conversation about your future." Richard Wellington stood there for a moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. The factory floor was buzzing with quiet conversations as workers and investors discussed what they had witnessed. But Richard's mind was already moving beyond the immediate situation. He was thinking about phone calls he needed to make and conversations he needed to have. "Tommy," Richard said, pulling out his phone, "I need to call your father. Right now." Tommy looked nervous. "Sir, you don't have to bother him. He's probably busy with the afternoon milking and he doesn't really like to talk about his old work much." "Trust me," Richard said, already dialing the number that Tommy had given him. "This is a conversation that's 15 years overdue." The phone rang several times before a familiar voice answered. Even after all these years, Richard recognized Dr. Robert Thompson's voice immediately. "Hello? Dr. Thompson, this is Richard Wellington from Midwest Manufacturing Corporation. I believe you know who I am." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Richard, how did you get this number? And why are you calling me?" "I'm calling because your son just saved my company from what could have been a very expensive disaster. He's standing right here next to me, having just repaired our main production machine in a way that impressed everyone in the building." Another pause. Longer this time. "Tommy fixed your German assembly unit?" "Not just fixed it," Richard said, looking at Tommy with renewed respect. "He diagnosed a complex hydraulic pressure issue that our head technician couldn't solve, and he did it in less than 30 minutes? Dr. Thompson, your son displayed a level of mechanical understanding that I haven't seen since you worked with us 15 years ago. Richard could hear Dr. Thompson sigh deeply on the other end of the phone. I was wondering when something like this might happen. Tommy's always been curious about how things work, and I've been teaching him since he was old enough to hold a wrench. Why didn't you tell him about your background with our company? He had no idea that you designed the original systems for our entire production line. Because I wanted him to develop his own relationship with learning and problem solving, Dr. Thompson explained. I didn't want him to feel like he had to live up to my reputation or follow in my footsteps. I wanted him to discover his own talents and interests without the pressure of being Dr. Thompson's son. Richard looked at Tommy, who was listening to one side of the conversation with growing understanding in his eyes. The young man was beginning to realize that there was much more to his father's past than he had ever known. Dr. Thompson, would you be willing to come down here? I think there are some things we need to discuss, and I'd prefer to do it in person. I'll be there in an hour, came the reply, and the line went dead. Richard put his phone away and turned back to Tommy. Your father is on his way. While we're waiting for him, I want to ask you something important. What are your plans for after high school? Tommy shrugged. I always figured I'd help run the farm. Dad's been teaching me about sustainable agriculture and land management. It's good work, and I enjoy it. But what about engineering? Based on what I saw today, you have incredible potential in that field. I've thought about it, Tommy admitted. I like figuring out how things work and solving mechanical problems. But college is expensive, and I don't want to burden my parents with that kind of debt. Richard exchanged glances with several of the investors, who had been listening to the conversation with great interest. He could see that they were thinking the same thing he was thinking. Tommy, what if I told you that wouldn't have to be a concern? Before Tommy could ask what he meant, one of the investors stepped forward. Young man, what you did today was remarkable. I've been investing in manufacturing companies for over 20 years, and I've never seen anything quite like it. Other investors began gathering around, each of them eager to share their thoughts about what they had witnessed. The way you approached that problem, another investor said, it showed real engineering thinking. Not just technical knowledge, but the ability to see connections that others missed. And your communication skills, added a third investor. You explained complex concepts in a way that everyone could understand. That's a rare talent. Richard held up his hand to quiet the growing conversation. Tommy, what these gentlemen are trying to say is that we'd like to make you an offer. A full scholarship to study engineering at the university of your choice, plus a guaranteed internship program that would allow you to work part-time with our company while you complete your education. Tommy's jaw dropped. A full scholarship? Are you serious? Completely serious, Richard confirmed. Your performance today demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking and problem-solving ability that we look for in our top engineers. And frankly, having Dr. Thompson's son working with us would be an honor. But I don't understand, Tommy said, still looking overwhelmed. I'm just a farm kid who got lucky today. Pete, the head technician, spoke up from where he had been quietly, observing the conversation. Son, what you did today wasn't luck. I've been working on machines for over 20 years, and I've never seen anyone diagnose a problem that quickly or accurately. You have a gift. One of the factory workers who had been watching the repair process nodded in agreement. That was real skill, Tommy. The way you listened to the machine and figured out what was wrong, that's something you can't fake. Tommy looked around at all the faces staring at him encouragingly. These were successful business people and experienced workers, and they were all telling him that he had something special. It was a lot to take in for someone who had started the day just sweeping floors and emptying trash cans. What would the internship involve? Tommy asked, his practical farm boy instincts kicking in. You'd work with our engineering team during school breaks and part-time during the semester, Richard explained. You'd get hands-on experience with all kinds of manufacturing systems, not just the machines you worked on today. Think of it as getting paid to learn from some of the best engineers in the industry. And after college? After college, if you're interested and if you perform well in the program, we'd love to offer you a full-time position as a junior engineer. Who knows? Maybe someday you'll be designing the next generation of manufacturing systems, just like your father did. The sound of a truck pulling into the parking lot caught everyone's attention. Through the factory windows, they could see an older pickup truck that had definitely seen better days. A man in work clothes got out and walked toward the building entrance. "That's my dad," Tommy said quietly. A few minutes later, Dr. Robert Thompson walked onto the factory floor. He looked exactly like what he was, a successful farmer who had been interrupted during his afternoon work. His clothes were practical and well-worn, his hands showed the calluses of physical labor, and there was hay stuck to his boots. But when he looked around the factory, his eyes showed the same intelligent curiosity that Tommy had displayed earlier. "Richard," Dr. Thompson said, extending a hand to the CEO. "It's been a long time." "Too long," Richard replied, shaking hands warmly. "Robert, your son just demonstrated abilities that I thought were extinct in his generation. The way he approached that machine problem, it was like watching you work 15 years ago." Dr. Thompson looked at Tommy with pride and a hint of amusement. "I was wondering when his curiosity about mechanical systems would get him into trouble. I just didn't expect it to happen quite like this." "Dad," Tommy said, "Mr. Wellington offered me a full scholarship to study engineering, plus an internship program. Did you know he was going to do that?" Dr. Thompson smiled. "I had no idea, but it doesn't surprise me. Richard always was good at recognizing talent when he saw it." "The question is," Richard said, "what do you think about the offer? I know you left the corporate world for good reasons, and I respect that choice, but Tommy has the potential to make real contributions to the field of engineering." Dr. Thompson was quiet for a long moment, looking at his son and then at the machine that Tommy had repaired. 15 years ago, I left this world because I wanted to focus on what really mattered to me, my family, and a simpler way of life. I've never regretted that decision, but Tommy is his own person, and he has to make his own choices about his future." He turned to his son. "What do you want to do, Tommy?" Tommy looked around the factory floor one more time, taking in the sophisticated machinery, the interested faces of the investors and workers, and the opportunities that were suddenly opening up before him. Then he looked at his father, the man who had taught him everything he knew about solving problems and understanding how the world worked. "I want to accept the offer," Tommy said finally, "but I also want to keep helping on the farm. Is there a way to do both?" Richard smiled. "I think we can work something out. After all, some of the best engineers I've known have understood that the principles that make a farm successful are the same ones that make any complex system work: patience, observation, and respect for how all the pieces fit together." "Dr. Thompson put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Then I think you've got yourself a deal." As Tommy shook hands with Richard Wellington, officially accepting the offer that would change his life,